The picture emerging from Donald Trump's return to power isn't just about political theater or campaign promises. It's about the fundamental architecture of American capitalism, revealing itself in ways that can no longer be hidden. What we're witnessing is the collision between a man's carefully constructed public persona and the material reality of decisions made decades ago, decisions rooted in profit margins, real estate deals, and the ruthless logic of accumulation that defines our economic system. When a political stunt designed to project strength and competence instead exposes the very contradictions a leader spent years trying to bury, we're not simply watching one individual's downfall. We're observing how power structures protect themselves, how capital flows determine political viability, and how the American public is forced to reckon with uncomfortable truths about who actually governs in a system where wealth and political authority have become inseparable. This isn't scandal for scandal's sake. This is about understanding that every political figure operates within an economic framework that shapes their choices, limits their options, and ultimately determines whether their past becomes their undoing. The stunt backfired because the contradictions were always there, waiting beneath the surface, embedded in the very system that elevated Trump in the first place. Let me begin by saying something that might sound obvious, but needs to be stated clearly. Political stunts only work when the underlying reality supports the narrative being sold. When there's a fundamental disconnect between what a politician claims to represent and what their actual history reveals, no amount of spectacle can bridge that gap permanently. And what we're seeing now with Donald Trump is precisely that disconnect becoming impossible to ignore. The stunt, whatever form it took, whether it was a photo opportunity, a policy announcement, or some carefully choreographed display of authority, was designed to project an image. But images, no matter how carefully crafted, eventually collide with material facts, with documented history, with the actual record of decisions made and actions taken. Now, to understand why this particular moment matters, we have to step back and look at the broader context of American political economy over the past 40 years. Trump didn't emerge from nowhere. He's a product of a specific era, a specific set of economic conditions, and a specific ideology that has dominated American capitalism since the late 1970s and early 1980s. This was the era when the post-war compromise between labor and capital began to unravel, when unions were systematically dismantled, when financial deregulation became the gospel of both major political parties, and when the real estate sector in particular became a playground for massive accumulation of wealth with minimal accountability. Trump built his empire, such as it is, during this period, and the methods he used, the shortcuts he took, the legal gray areas he exploited, all of this was not just tolerated but actively encouraged by the prevailing economic ideology of the time. The dark past that's surfacing now isn't just about personal moral failings or individual character flaws, though those certainly exist. What we're really talking about is a systematic pattern of behavior that reflects the values of a particular kind of capitalism. We're talking about leveraging debt, declaring bankruptcy to avoid obligations to workers and contractors, using legal loopholes to minimize tax contributions while benefiting from public infrastructure, engaging in discriminatory practices in housing that enriched private developers while perpetuating racial segregation and inequality. These aren't aberrations. These are features of the system as it was designed to operate during that period. Trump simply played the game according to the rules that existed, rules written by and for people exactly like him. But here's where it gets interesting from an analytical standpoint. The American public has a complicated relationship with wealth and success. On one hand, there's a deep cultural mythology around the self-made businessman, the deal maker, the person who understands how to navigate the market and come out on top. This mythology served Trump well during his initial rise to political prominence. People were willing to overlook questionable business practices because they bought into the narrative that business acumen translates into political competence, that someone who knows how to make money knows how to govern. This is, of course, a fundamental category error. Running a private enterprise where you answer only to yourself and a handful of investors is nothing like managing a democratic government where you're supposed to be accountable to millions of citizens with diverse and often conflicting needs. But the mythology persisted because it serves the interests of capital to conflate these two entirely different domains. On the other hand, Americans also have a sense of fairness, a belief that rules should apply equally, that people who break the rules should face consequences, that power shouldn't be entirely disconnected from responsibility. And this is where the stunt backfires. Because when you stage a political performance designed to demonstrate strength, competence, or moral authority, you're implicitly inviting scrutiny. You're asking people to look at you and affirm the image you're projecting. But if that scrutiny reveals not strength, but exploitation, not competence but failure papered over with bankruptcy protections, not moral authority but a pattern of behavior that violated basic norms of fairness and decency, then the whole performance collapses in on itself. What makes this moment particularly significant is that it's happening in a context where the American working class is increasingly aware of how thoroughly they've been betrayed by the economic system of the past 40 years. Wages have stagnated while productivity has soared, meaning workers are producing more value but seeing less of it in their paychecks. Healthcare costs have skyrocketed while coverage has become more precarious. Education costs have exploded, saddling an entire generation with debt. Housing has become unaffordable in most major cities. Retirement security has evaporated as pensions have been replaced with inadequate 401k plans subject to market volatility. All of this has happened while wealth has concentrated at the very top in historically unprecedented ways. People are angry, and rightfully so. They're looking for explanations, for accountability, for someone to blame. Trump's political success in 2016 was built partly on channeling that anger, on positioning himself as an outsider who would shake up the system, drain the swamp, fight for the forgotten man and woman. It was an audacious bit of political theater, a billionaire real estate developer from Manhattan presenting himself as the champion of working-class Americans. And it worked, to a degree, because the Democratic Party establishment had so thoroughly abandoned working-class economic interests in favor of financial sector priorities that many voters were willing to try something, anything, different. But now, as the dark past surfaces, as the actual record becomes undeniable, that narrative becomes harder and harder to sustain. How can you claim to be the champion of working people when your own business history is littered with stiffed contractors, unpaid workers, and bankruptcies that protected your personal wealth while others absorbed the losses? The stunt backfiring isn't just a tactical political failure. It's a symptom of a deeper contradiction within American capitalism itself. The system requires a certain level of public legitimacy to function. People have to believe, at least to some extent, that the system is fundamentally fair, that hard work is rewarded, that rules apply to everyone, that leadership positions are earned through merit, or at least through adherence to some basic standards of competence and integrity. When that belief erodes completely, when it becomes impossible to maintain the fiction, the system faces a legitimacy crisis. And we're living through that crisis right now. Consider what happens when someone like Trump, who embodies so many of the worst aspects of our economic system, occupies the highest political office. Every revelation about his past, every documented instance of exploitation or deception or abuse of power doesn't just damage him personally, it damages the credibility of the entire structure of wealth and power that elevated him. It forces people to ask uncomfortable questions. If someone with this kind of history can become president, what does that say about our democracy? If the rules didn't apply to him when he was building his business empire, and they don't apply to him now when he's wielding political power, do the rules apply to anyone at the top? And if not, why should ordinary people continue to play by rules that only constrain them while the powerful operate in a completely different legal and moral universe? These are dangerous questions for any system built on hierarchy and inequality. And the more the dark past surfaces, the more unavoidable these questions become. The stunt was supposed to distract from these questions, to redirect attention, to reassert control over the narrative. But instead, it had the opposite effect. It drew more attention to the contradictions, made them more visible, made them harder to ignore or rationalize away. Now, let's talk about what this means for the broader political economy going forward. We're at a moment of transition, a moment where old arrangements are breaking down, but new ones haven't yet been established. The neoliberal consensus that dominated from Reagan through Obama is dead, though its corpse still shambles through our institutions. Neither major political party has successfully articulated a coherent alternative vision that addresses the actual material conditions facing most Americans. Trump represented one kind of response to this vacuum, a nationalist, authoritarian response that promised to restore American greatness through force of will and rejection of multilateral institutions. But that response was always built on sand because it never addressed the fundamental economic arrangements that created the crisis in the first place. The backfiring stunt reveals the emptiness at the heart of that project. You can't solve problems created by unregulated capitalism and massive inequality by simply being more aggressive about defending the interests of capital. You can't restore security and dignity to working people by implementing policies that further concentrate wealth and power. You can't build a functioning society on a foundation of exploitation and deception, no matter how skillfully you manipulate symbols and emotions. Eventually, reality asserts itself. Eventually, the contradictions become too large to paper over. And this brings us to a crucial question. What comes next? Because when one political project fails, when its contradictions become undeniable, space opens for alternatives. The real political struggle right now isn't just about Trump as an individual, though he's certainly part of it. The struggle is about what kind of economic system we're going to have, what kind of society we're going to build, who's going to have power, and how that power is going to be exercised. The surfacing of Trump's dark past and the backfiring of his stunts create an opportunity for a different conversation, a conversation about systemic change rather than just personnel changes. We could be having a serious national discussion about workplace democracy, about giving workers actual power over the enterprises they make productive through their labor. We could be discussing how to restructure our economy so that it serves human needs rather than treating human beings as disposable inputs to profit generation. We could be debating different models of ownership, different ways of organizing production and distribution, different mechanisms for ensuring that everyone who contributes to social wealth gets a fair share of what they help create. These conversations are starting to happen, but they're still marginalized, still treated as radical or unrealistic by mainstream political discourse. The reason these conversations remain marginalized is because they threaten existing power structures. The people who benefit from the current arrangement have enormous resources to defend it. They control most major media outlets. They fund political campaigns. They employ armies of lawyers and lobbyists to write legislation and regulation in their favor. They've constructed an entire ideological apparatus to convince people that the current system, despite its obvious failures and injustices, is the only possible system, that any alternative would be worse, that we should be grateful for what we have, even as what we have becomes increasingly inadequate for basic human flourishing. Trump's dark past surfacing and his stunt backfiring don't automatically change this power structure, but they do create cracks in the facade, moments where the gap between mythology and reality becomes visible, opportunities for different ideas to gain traction. When people see clearly that the emperor has no clothes, that the person claiming to represent their interests actually has a long history of exploiting people exactly like them, political possibilities shift. The narrative that protected the existing arrangement loses some of its power. Questions that were previously dismissed as unreasonable start to seem necessary and urgent. This is why the moment matters beyond just the immediate political drama. We're watching the slow-motion collapse of a particular way of organizing economic and political life, a way that concentrated enormous wealth and power in very few hands while leaving the majority of people increasingly insecure and precarious. That system is failing on its own terms. It's not delivering prosperity, stability, or security. It's generating crisis after crisis, each one more severe than the last. The financial crisis of 2008, the ongoing climate emergency, the pandemic and its catastrophically mismanaged response, the resurgence of far-right authoritarianism, the breakdown of international cooperation. All of these are symptoms of a system that no longer works, if it ever really did. Trump is both a symptom and an accelerant of this broader failure. His dark past is the past of American capitalism over the past 40 years, a period of massive deregulation, financialization, and wealth extraction. His stunts backfire because the underlying reality can't support the mythology anymore. The contradictions are too sharp, too obvious, too painful for too many people. And while his individual political fate is uncertain, the broader crisis of legitimacy facing our economic and political system is undeniable. We're living through a period where fundamental questions about how we organize our collective life are back on the table, whether those who benefit from the current arrangement want them there or not. The stunt backfired because reality always wins eventually, and reality right now is demanding change that the existing power structure cannot or will not provide. That's the real story here, beyond the headlines and the drama. And it's a story that will continue to unfold regardless of what happens to any individual politician.